This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, Sampath. X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, has gone offline in Brazil. The country's Supreme Court issued an order to block X in Brazil after Elon Musk refused to appoint a legal representative for the company in this country. This defiance came on the heels of repeated flouting of the Supreme Court's orders to block certain far-right accounts that were allegedly spreading misinformation. Now, X has more than 22 million users in Brazil, making it the fifth largest market for the company, and all of them suddenly find themselves cut off from their accounts. The Supreme Court judge who ordered the ban, Alexandre de Moraes, has also said in his order that those who use VPN to access X will face a fine of 50,000 reals or about $8,850 per day, which is a pretty steep fine. Musk, meanwhile, has gone all out vilifying Judge Moraes, calling him, among other things, an evil dictator, Darth Vader, Voldemort, and so on. Now, the ban on X in Brazil has raised several questions about the global governance of social media. For instance, does this ban amount to some form of censorship, as Musk has been claiming? Is it okay for an American tech platform owner to publicly back a certain political faction in another country, as Musk has been doing? Can an MNC, for instance, expect to operate in a given country without complying with local laws? And what lessons does this court decision hold for other nations in the global south, such as India? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we are joined by Jyoti Panday, who is with the Internet Governance Project at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Jyoti, welcome to In Focus. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jyoti, to start with, I was wondering if you can give us a quick overview, sort of contextualizing this ban on X and its connection to the Jan 2023 riots in Brasilia after the elections and so on.
Certainly. So, in my view, the controversy began much before the Jan 8 riots, which I'll come to in a bit. But let's rewind to 2018 when there was when a journalist published an article exposing how a group of Brazilian businessmen was spending big money to slander presidential candidate Bolsonaro's rival Fernando Haddad on Meta's WhatsApp platform. And so what they were doing was basically they were using data that they had acquired illegally, and they were targeting segments of the population with disinformation. Right after this article was published, the Brazil Superior Electoral Court, which comprised 3 Supreme Court justices, 2 Superior Court judges, and 2 lawyers, basically they set up a committee to look into this, to investigate if these claims were true. And during the investigation and after they published the report saying that yes, the 2018 elections were in fact kind of rigged and disinformation was used to target voters, there were the threats from the far right in Brazil against these judges and against Supreme Court judges kind of increased. And because the police was, it appeared as if the police was not being able to kind of take care of these threats against these judges, the Supreme Court, the system's failure to actually adequately address these threats against the Supreme and Superior Electoral Court judges prompted the Chief Justice to issue a decree in 2019 which allowed Supreme Court Minister Alexandre de Moraes to actually directly supervise federal investigation into these threats.
Just a second, Jyoti, sorry to interrupt. This 2018 election, this was the election which Bolsonaro won, right?
Right, correct. That's correct. And because there was no, even though the court confirmed that the Bolsonaro campaign had used social media to commit election fraud in 2018, they were unable to actually quantify the fraud's impact at that point. And the elections were, this happened in 2018 and they're investigating and the results are coming out in 2019, right? So they couldn't really issue any punitive measures, and they just continued. But however, this led to an awareness amongst the judges and the broader community that the social media platforms were an important tool which were impacting elections and democracy, and therefore these social media platforms came under scrutiny. And simultaneously, the judges, because they felt unsafe, had empowered themselves and given one of theirs power to kind of impose rules and regulations that these social media platforms should comply with. So this tension is situated in these developments that far like that precede and go a little bit further back than the storming of the Supreme Court and the Capitol. So just continuing with the story here, obviously the Moray was not really popular with the far right, and he's been like claims of him being a communist dictator have been widespread, and it's quite telling that he's really well hated amongst far right allies as well. And as and as part of his investigation, kind of being cognizant of the fact that they couldn't really take any measures against the Bolsonaro campaign in 2018. This Justice Moraes kind of ordered arrest to prevent this in like elections going forward. And notable figures in the Brazilian political community were kind of detained for their actions against the court. And inspired by the US events, Bolsonaro supporters also spread a stop the steal narrative, and they, were kind of trying to garner far right support internationally. After losing the election, of course, everybody knows Bolsonaro fled the country, leaving his vice president in charge. And in the final days before Lula took office, Bolsonaro supporter attempted bombings and violent attacks. Another important event here was where they discovered that, following the elections, after Lula took office, there were a bunch of bombings in schools, and the investigation into that led to the realization that there were neo-Nazi accounts that were inciting young children to bomb and take action, to do something drastic on April 20th, which is Hitler's birthday. And so basically there was another parallel investigation into these terrorist activities, and social media platforms also got embroiled in that, where the Supreme Court kind of ordered that these platforms should be deplatformed, these accounts should be deplatformed, and they were facing increased regulatory pressure. So I think a lot of this, Elon initially chose to defy these orders. Then, for a brief moment in 2023, he did kind of comply. But as increasingly his personal stance and ideology has moved towards the right, his defiance has grown, and the scrutiny, therefore, is impacted by like many different factors. There's a whole very complex narrative and a sequence of events that have contributed to this ban. The ban hasn't emerged it's not a whim where a government or a judge is overreaching. The laws and the kind of tensions that have been thrown up by how social media platforms are being used have been have dictated the kind of laws that are being enacted in Brazil. And in 2023, they did go after like a fake speech law, and there's, free speech is not absolute. Like in India, in Brazil, there are other fundamental rights. If free speech is impacting the guarantee of those other fundamental rights, then it's not okay. And therefore, from the Brazilian perspective, curtailing of free speech in these instances is justified, and Musk seems to be defying and not following local orders. And that's like the whole tension that is driving this ban.
Right. I mean, thank you for that detailed background, Jyoti. Really appreciate that. Now, this ban, I think, was the immediate trigger was this 24-hour ultimatum to appoint a legal representative, and Musk refusing to do it. But didn't he say something like he's going to shut down X sometime in August, mid-August? Then did he not shut it down? Like, what's going on there? I mean, why? How come there was no legal representative? Was the legal representative withdrawn? Or was there never a legal representative at all?
So I think he did Twitter did have legal representatives in Brazil. That's part of the local law requirement. And they did have an office. It's not entirely clear what. So let's go back to April 3rd, 2024. That's when the Twitter files from Brazil, was kind of released alleging crimes. So basically, a fake narrative was created by, I'm forgetting the name of the person, but there's somebody who claimed that Alexandre de Moraes had pressed criminal charges against Twitter's Brazil lawyer for refusing to turn over personal information on political enemies. And Elon Musk, of course, shared these tweets, which went viral and, were embraced by far right and Bolsonaro and his supporters. A lot of the Brazilian media exposed this to be the flaws in these claims, and to the point where the person who had initially tweeted and laid out these claims, he went online and apologized and said that he didn't have evidence and this was disinformation. However, 3 days later, Elon Musk kind of announced that he would stop obeying, because he was convinced that Alexander de Moraes had kind of targeted his platform, or that's the narrative he decided to stick with. He decided that he would his company and X would stop obeying court orders in Brazil, and would also reinstate accounts of those deplatforms. So like I mentioned, remember, following these multiple investigations, the Supreme Court was kind of was empowered, and they were issuing orders to the social media platforms and working with them and asking them to deplatform a lot of accounts that were either violating laws that were already in place, or were kind of engaging in speech that would impact other fundamental rights, such as fair election, or hate speech, or pedophilia, etc. In this case, why Elon decided to stop obeying Brazilian court orders, it's not entirely clear. It's not a whim, in my opinion. I think it's fueled by several factors, and we can delve into that next in a bit more detail.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say it's not a whim, because I was wondering what is the logic here? Because it's not that it was just to do with this particular Supreme Court judge, because he has been obeying local laws in other countries, in Turkey, in China. I think there was the rest of the world data which said that he has been obeying local laws in 83% of the cases, or whatever. So, and he also has other businesses in Brazil. He's got Starlink, which is sort of making connectivity possible in the Amazon. They initially refused to comply, and then they turned around. So there is a lot going on here. So is there anything one can sort of infer in terms of what his thinking has been, if it's not a whim?
So before I get into the rationale, just to kind of continue and just close that loop of what happened. So once Elon decided to defy the court's orders, there were obviously fines that were issued by the court, and these have now accumulated to about 9 million reals. So in this case, after the ban on X, Starlink's assets were also frozen, because Elon had refused to pay these fines and to comply, and he had accrued these huge fines. The assets were kind of, and once he pays these fines, the assets may be again, unfrozen. But for now, that's the situation. On his decision to defy the Brazilian government, I think there is a complex interplay of political, legal, and ideological factors here. He has a personality which he is very open about, and which he likes to flaunt using his platforms and his companies. Forget Turkey and China. Let's talk about India. X has been, working really closely with the Indian government, and whatever tensions that may have arisen in the past about Twitter, as it was known back then, kind of challenging the IT rules, etc., have disappeared the moment Elon took over the company's leadership. So it's not that the problems in the IT rules for social media platforms have disappeared, but clearly it's not a priority for Elon or the company or the platform under his leadership. And but going back to his ideological beliefs and his public image, I think he believes that he perceives these court orders coming from Brazil or any other country as an infringement on this principle of his libertarian views on free speech, which he often champions publicly.
Yeah, but if he's a libertarian when it comes to free speech, and if it's an ideological quality that he embraces so much, how does that disappear when it comes to India?
Right. I think that's a really critical question that, everyone should be asking. That firstly, should such a personality driven approach to platform regulation be tolerated? So ultimately, if let's talk about markets and like it's about either the state exerting control over speech or platforms kind of driving up their own rules and exerting control over speech. And in either case, we have to be wary of what is the reason for why control is being driven or being pursued by either side. It can't be on the whims and fancies because you choose to. There have to be principle based approach on either sides, right? And in this case, it would appear that Brazil has escalated the situation over a period of time. It's not sudden. However, the aggressive stance shown by Elon is kind of, how would the supporters of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP government and their allies react to Elon Musk if he suddenly turned around tomorrow and started targeting, for whatever reason, decided to target Prime Minister Modi and his leadership and challenge the laws of this nation and kind of, call him a dictator? Now, clearly, as the leader of a platform that is operating in multiple markets, there has to be a certain degree of seriousness that comes with and responsibility that comes with that position. And in this case, like his behavior with regards to these orders and also his personal attacks on these judges, has been far from what is expected in these situations.
Yeah, no, right. I think you sort of nailed it here when you said this whole personality driven management of a social media platform. With so many people involved. Now, coming to the human side of it, on the one hand, you have of course these big issues, the macro level questions about internet governance, but at the micro level, you have like 22 million people. Many of them, they either directly or indirectly they use the platform for their jobs, professions, livelihoods. So, what happens when an entire nation of so many individuals are cut off from such a life-defining, discourse-defining platform such as X? Is it easy, or is it even viable to migrate to some other platform which is much smaller and take it forward from there? What happens in such a scenario?
I think I would be a bit wary of assigning so much power to platforms which are basically communication systems, and they might. And let's remember, things become popular and things die. That's the nature of demand and supply. What may work 5 years back may not be popular 10 years down the line. So, given this, and in this case, like X may have lost 22 million users, but Blue Sky gained 2 million Brazilian users in just 3 days. So, somebody's loss is somebody's gain. In India, when TikTok was banned, again, these issues of what happens to all of these content creators that were using it to create their livelihood, they survive. They move to other platforms. It may not be the exact same ecosystem with the same incentives, but I think people have who are determined to kind of find a way to communicate or to make a livelihood of platforms will find a way. And I think what is a far more significant question in these situations is what are the grounds based on which these kind of freedoms and choices can be taken away from consumers. So, if, for example, when the TikTok ban happened in India, national security was an issue, right? And generally, the courts rule in favor of national security. There was a Breyer encryption case recently where the courts ruled that national security concerns trump free speech. So we know that's how the Indian government and the courts line up with regards to freedoms and national security, where they stand. But even in those scenarios, why is it okay to kind of ban platforms yet continue to take investment from China and seek further investment from China? So the national security imperatives need to be further defined. And going back to the Brazilian question or the Indian, wherever something is being banned, I think the principles based on which and the proportionality of that ban and having a transparent, really thought through approach to it, that's like more important than worrying about what is going to happen if it stops to exist. Because I think, given how digital services and platforms are integrated into our lives, and given how much they are being used in influence operations by both, and by to kind of channel and create and manufacture domestic opinion making and agenda setting. I think it's really important to think through how much of an influence these platforms should have in our lives and how we access and use them to kind of exercise our fundamental rights. So, without assigning them too much responsibility, I think it's really imperative that the governments think through these approaches of banning and under what conditions services are being banned and whether these bans are proportionate and necessary.
Right. I mean, I agree that, of course, we need to think more carefully about the conditions in which such bans are considered okay, and especially also given that they do have an impact while they exist, and also when they are taken away or the access to them is taken away. Now, coming to a slightly different point, Jyoti, Elon Musk and this ecosystem, the supporters of Bolsonaro in this case, they are sort of projecting themselves as some kind of champions of free speech in this context, and the judge and those who are concerned about disinformation and misinformation spreading on these platforms are sort of portrayed as censors, as sort of pushing censorship. How does one understand this kind of narrative building? Is there a sensible way to counter this, or is this going to play out the way it usually does on the basis of the might of numbers and bots and stuff?
It's a tricky one in the sense that anyone whose speech is suppressed is going to kind of argue for free speech, right? And in this case, the far right here seems to be saying that, Musk and his supporters and the far right argue that these bans they constitute as an infringement on free speech. However, the Supreme Court in Brazil has been clear. They have said that X can return to Brazil if it complies with local laws. But if you're not complying with laws that have been democratically made, then the question becomes that at what point can private platforms defy national laws, and how are users to determine if this is in their best interest or not? And that's a very complicated question because everybody is going to work from their perspective and what they want to push as an idea. So, for example, the persecuted are going to feel and argue that, their free speech is being taken away and their rights are being trampled upon.
But in this case, given that the persecuted are hate mongers and they're sort of inciting violence and so on, doesn't that principle of tolerating the intolerant promotes intolerance kind of an argument, doesn't it work in this context?
Sure, and it should. And it's something we should all heavily bat on, that just because I don't like what you say, I should not have the right to prevent you from saying it. I may have the right to remove myself from that situation and not hear it anymore, but I should not stop you from saying what I don't like to hear. And that principle should always hold. However, in this case, in Brazil, the laws are not just about local representative and platforms having to comply with court orders. Fair and free elections is a fundamental right. And when certain accounts using a particular platform are spreading disinformation that impacts the integrity of elections, then that's a threshold that becomes a higher threshold for the free speech marker to kind of, justify it. So I think in this case, again, these are questions better that will be answered and which are being contemplated. So after Moraes issued the order for the ban, there was another committee set up by the Supreme Court to kind of assess if the ban order was valid or not. And the assessment, I mean, they concluded that yes, the ban was fair, and a private company cannot flout national laws. And if the users of that platform have a problem, then they should participate in democratic processes and change the policymakers who are making these laws instead of exerting pressure or opting for giving so much power to a private platform where it defies the laws of their own country.
Right. Now, some critics and commentators, writing about this entire saga, they have said that while the decision of the Supreme Court to impose a ban on Twitter on X, because they are, of course, you can't really defy local laws. While that is reasonable, they say they have found an issue with this decision to impose a fine of about 50,000 reals on those users who access or continue to access X using virtual private networks or VPNs, and that they find unreasonable. It's a too much of a fine. Is that do you agree with that kind of an assessment?
I absolutely agree with that assessment because VPNs are not just used by, again, VPNs are kind of services that are used by both terrorists and dissidents, and ones that are trying to evade state scrutiny are always on the good side and the bad side. And any kind of decision to that would impact their existence should be weighed in quite seriously, and there should be a lot of thought given to it.
But this fine is only for using VPN to access X. You can use VPN to access other sites. So where is the problem here? Don't access X, but use VPN for other purposes.
Yeah, but I feel like if the user is determined to avoid and evade a Supreme Court ban to access Twitter, it doesn't work like that. Bans don't work like that. You can't have a partial ban where you say that you can not access Twitter, but you can access other services, because tomorrow that power will be used to ban and restrict access to yet another platform. So the question is fundamentally, the court kind of reacting to Elon Musk's provocation and aggressive stance and taking extreme steps to counter his extreme steps is justified, because it's basically warfare between that platform and its owner and the Brazilian authorities. However, bringing in fundamental technologies that impact freedoms and fundamental rights into the fray, just because as an escalation to this kind of conflict and tension, I feel that's going too far. And I would agree that the ban on VPNs is not justified. I think the position of the government, how many people, I feel like the population that would take the effort to use VPN to access Twitter would be quite low. And if that few really want to make these efforts to access Twitter, then they should, because, I don't feel that this kind of high fine for evading censorship is justified in any scenario, even when the Supreme Court is largely correct.
Right. I mean, you would say that VPN is such a fundamental technology. Sort of bringing it into the debate itself is a dangerous thing. That's a point well taken. We're running out of time, Jyoti. One last question, a big picture question before we wrap up. Sometimes these kinds of local legal requirements, maybe not in the case of Brazil, where there is, as we have discussed, a lot of solid ground, especially questions of electoral integrity of elections are concerned, which have consequences for democracy and so on. But there are many other cases where these kinds of bans do amount to censorship. There is, of course, the case of China and the Indian government's well-documented takedown requests, of accounts, not just on X, but on Facebook, etc., Instagram, etc., which are critical of the regime. Now, these are really, they do amount to censorship. So Musk might be right here if you were to take it up. So is it possible to have some kind of an international governing principle or mechanism or norm that could sort of help people sort of understand what exactly is a legitimate demand, and also maybe arbitrate between governments and companies like X to maintain a meaningful line between misuse of the platform and legitimate free speech rights?
I think that's a great question. I feel this instance of Elon Musk's very erratic behavior has exposed a pretty fundamental flaw in the communication ecosystem. So when it comes to content which is illegal and manifestly illegal, for example, child pornography or Nazi speech, etc., or terrorist content. And there are again, some tensions in with regard to these kind of content as well. There have been efforts in the recent past, which and some of them quite successful to a degree, where states and markets have come together to precisely do what you asked, to create a regulatory framework where they can work together and cooperate to take down speech and arbitrate between demands and what is possible so that it doesn't impact the overall communication environment. But when it comes to political speech, I feel the contours are not as well defined, and therefore it is going to remain a contested territory. For example, let's go back to Elon Musk's Twitter account over the last week, where he has been out and out supporting Trump. This is a US election where Trump is standing against Kamala Harris. And he posted a picture of Kamala in a red suit, calling her a commie and something, and you just basically derogatory statements, etc. Now, imagine in the Indian scenario, if for whatever reason Elon Musk decided to degrade our Prime Minister Modi and tweet in favor of any of his political opponents. Would the Indian government and the Indian public tolerate this kind of defiance? And why should one person's political preferences impact the company's positioning in a particular market? I think these are far more important questions, and the boundaries around having platforms. So this is where the local laws versus, and the whole Brazilian court orders and the ban is it's being seen as a victory for sovereignty and the digital sovereignty. People who argue for digital sovereignty, and make these claims. I feel if we walk down these labels of sovereignty, etc., it's going to lead to a lot of fragmentation. But what is far more important is kind of having those boundaries well defined, that at which point is it okay for a platform to kind of walk away from national laws and say that this is not in favor of my or my company's and my platform's interests, or the citizens' interests, and in whose interests are the platforms then? They would need to justify why they are not complying with local laws. Here it appears that Elon is making these decisions in his interests and his shareholders' interests and his ideological interests. And in that case, should it be okay for a government to take action? In my opinion, yes. If the personal and the political, if there's no kind of boundary between them, then states are bound to take action. And this is just this very complicated scenario playing out. But we can see this happening in other jurisdictions like India, like any other country, actually, including the US.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Jyoti. I think you made an important point there. I think in this particular case, it's fairly clear that the company's interests, in this case X, are sort of more or less become marginalized to Elon Musk's own interests. I don't know if you could call it interests or personal passions, ideological or otherwise, his libertarian leanings, his current attachment to Trump. And he hasn't always been a right winger. He has been a Democrat earlier, and he has moved, and with this kind of a completely unpredictable kind of personality driven management of a social platform does sort of raise a lot of complications. And not today it's Brazil, tomorrow it could be some other country, but it also raises other questions for I think shareholders here in this case, because the Twitter is part of a group of companies which Musk manages. There is Tesla, there is Starlink, there is SpaceX, and they will have implication. One sometimes wonder whether the reason he is sort of so keen to follow every single law in China is because of Tesla. One would wonder.
It is true. And so this is it. Like if your interests and your business interests are driving, and it's fine, it is absolutely okay for somebody to be ideologically driven. It is also okay for someone to prioritize the company's profits and have that as a motivation. The question is that if this is what motivates you and if this is what is guiding your behavior, then should you be in charge of one of the biggest communication platforms in the world? Or certainly one of the most influential communication platforms in the world. And that's a question that, is not just for X and Elon, it's also a question for governments, because let's understand that the influence of Twitter comes from the fact that its users are creating that influence, right? A lot of the public service related communication is happening on Twitter. That's where a lot of the opinion making is happening, because a lot of the other traditional media formats have been depleted by not funding and by not, kind of weakening of the accountability mechanisms and transparency mechanisms. So it's if we need to kind of look at our overall media ecosystem and see where X fits in and how much power should be given and what is the scope and boundaries of these platforms, without having these whims and fancies kind of dictated. I will also ask, kind of put in a reminder here that even before this whole ban on Twitter in Brazil and this entire controversy erupted, one of the first things that Elon did after he came to, became in charge of X, was to fire a lot of teams all around the world, including India. So Twitter had an office in Mumbai, in New Delhi, and in Bangalore. And both the Mumbai and the New Delhi offices don't exist anymore. There's just a Bangalore office, and it is in compliance with IT rules, which is our Indian laws, which ask for a local representative. In many cases, these local representative demands are kind of like a hostage type situation. But given these parameters, think about the implications of dismantling entire teams that were responsible for policing, for monitoring, for evaluating, and assessing the speech on this platform that no longer exists. And no wonder that there is going to be problems. And how is then, and that one representative sitting in the Bangalore office is then going to be bombarded with requests and orders. And in that scenario, they are going to over comply, or in if it doesn't fit Elon Musk's agenda and objective, they're going to walk away. And this is not a sustainable environment for any kind of platform, whether it's a communication platform or not. And I think these are questions for our policymakers to sit and deliberate on, whether, how do we go about managing this environment, not coming at it from a left versus right kind of ideological viewpoint, which is the driver of these instances, but thinking through it from a perspective of what would good governance require.
Right, very important points there, Jyoti. Appreciate that. I think there is also this big question which you touched upon tangentially, which is, of course, this entire conflict of interest riding on the man who is in charge of what is essentially a public square, a town square, where people come and discuss and debate, and agendas are set, opinions are formed, influences are done, and narratives are built. So, should a person with such conflicts of interest with multiple businesses in different continents be in charge of this kind of a weighted platform? That is the big question. Anyway, we run out of time now. Thank you so much once again, Jyoti, for joining us, sharing your thoughts and insights on this very interesting subject. Hopefully, we'll have you back sometime soon on a related topic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.